questions from the audience, the Zoom live stream. Yeah, so without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Ramsey McGlazer. So just give us a minute to open up that.
It's shared with the Calcom email.
Oh, really? Yeah. Is he on?
It should be.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Give us a second. So
Sure,
sorry,
no
technical
problem.
difficulties.
No, this is on me because I literally just sent the slides, so it's entirely on me.
Slowly but surely.
I'm thinking
Oh my gosh.
I'm thinking between 20 minutes and half an hour of comments, and then we'll open it up for questions, as many as you have.
Let me just open up the slides and then.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so I gave my talk the title "Missing People in Pandemics in Comparative Literature."
Awesome, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. So I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak. I especially want to thank the organizers, all the organizers of this symposium, including Komal and Herlin, for their interest in my work and their work to make this event possible. You can all hear me? Yeah. I can take off. Yeah, I was wondering. The speaker's prerogative. So when I asked Komal and Herlin what they had in mind for the keynote and how they were understanding the key terms in the title of today's symposium, Interconnected, the Nature of Unity in Literature, I received the following reply. I'm quoting Komal not to put her on the spot, but rather to let you, undergraduate students, set the tone for the talk that follows and for the day as a whole, the symposium as a whole. So let me quote briefly. Komal wrote, quote, "We decided on the theme interconnected to give space to the process of research, which we understand as forging connections and discovering unities." The scare quotes are Komal's. Komal continued by noting that there were shared struggles, experiences that all presenting authors went through regardless of their specific topics. We wanted to place an emphasis on community. I'll come back to the unity and community, and celebrate the work students have accomplished in spite of the pandemic. These are really great goals, worthy and admirable goals. And in the next 20 to 30 minutes, I'll try to remain mindful of them. Two things struck me immediately in Komal's response to my question, and I hope you'll forgive me if I pivot now into professor mode. I don't want to, I haven't yet been in professor mode in case it wasn't obvious, but now I will be. I don't want to suggest that I was reading the email the way I would read a student essay, but my ears did prick up and I was intrigued when I read Komal's definition of the process of research, her phrase, right? Forging connections and discovering unities. This is a strong working definition of scholarship, and perhaps scholarship in comparative literature most of all. But I noted something, which is that the two halves, right, the two parts of the formulation aren't strictly equivalent, right? To forge connections is to bring something new into being, if only a temporary bridge or bond, a synapse or suggestion, a passage from point A to point B that was not there previously, right? Forge connection implies, right, this process of bringing a new passage into being, right? By contrast, to discover unities is to lay bare, expose, or uncover, to seek and find something pre-existing. A process of discovery, you may have in mind the paradigmatic case of European claims to have discovered, what quote unquote, discovered the Americas. This is a process of location rather than invention, where what's located in and through the process precedes the moment of discovery, right? You don't discover something unless it's there before you and precedes the moment of discovery, right? We don't call it then discovery, but something else, like forging. Komal's email then prompted me to ask, what does it mean to think of our work, whether our work as comparativists or as researchers more generally, as a matter of locating unities that are already there or pre-existing? Can such unities be presupposed? You will have gathered that I'm a lot more comfortable maybe you will have gathered, I'm not sure, that I'm a lot more comfortable with the notion of forging connections than with the idea of discovering unities, which gives me a little bit of pause. That doesn't mean I think we should simply dispense with, or could simply dispense with it. On the contrary, in the time I have left, I'd like to think with you about the implications, the potentials, and maybe some of the limitations also of the idea of unity. This will also be a way of obliquely addressing the other questions asked implicitly in Komel's email and addressed to me, I think, by the whole committee, which are the following. How can we affirm the collective and collaborative nature of our work, especially in these challenging times? Why compare literatures now or ever, and what does it mean to be brought together or gathered in by a commitment to comparison? Does a commitment to comparison, or comparativism, as it's sometimes called, necessarily complicate any and all claims to unity? Before I speak to these questions, I'd like to turn to the potentials, the promise of unity, or something like it, and the admirable reasons Komel gives for wanting to highlight unity in the present moment. The whole presentation will not be centered on Komel's email, I promise. I did want to give it pride of place, but we'll move on in just a second, right? So the admirable reasons Komel gives for wanting to highlight unity in the present. The pandemic made it all too clear that we cannot do without community. We felt the need for it in its absence after it went missing, or at least I did. There is a unity in community, but that doesn't mean, of course, that all communities are unities, that there aren't fractures, rifts, divides, debates, and differences of various kinds within any and every community. What we felt then was perhaps not so much the need for unity as the need for gathering, for assembling, for coming together in real time and not just virtual space, sharing a meal or conversation, an atmosphere, or, as we say in California, an energy in a room together. Another indirect or even inverse indication that we cannot do without something like unity came to me more recently, just last week. I don't know how many of you followed the news about the Amazon fulfillment center in Staten Island that became the first in the country to vote to form a union very recently. In the days following that victory for the union cause, ALU, the name of the union, right? The corporation announced that it would be banning a whole host of words and phrases from its chat app for employees. Perhaps some of you saw, it was circulating on social media, at least on my timeline, the list of words and phrases to be banned. Here it is. And if we had more time, we could maybe read this, experiment with various configurations of the words and phrases, producing a poem, right? A kind of like found poem, right?
Like
we
the
did this,
magnetic pieces, yeah.
right? And we did this in my graduate seminar. It was really interesting. There was like a kind of choral reading, and then people just like reading the phrases and words that came to them. It was beautiful. I mean, in a dark way, right? Very, very beautiful. Ominous, but beautiful. So if we had more time, we could also think more about all the words and phrases chosen. They're not all of a piece. Some seem clearly related to the union cause, ongoing efforts to organize at Amazon, and complaints about the material conditions of employment there. But others seem so basic as to be unavoidable. Like, it's hard to know how you would even avoid a reference to restrooms. For example, if something was happening involving the restroom and you needed to refer to it, right? Like, that's a really quite basic piece of the vocabulary that you might need to draw on. So much for free speech. That's a principle that evidently doesn't apply when one's on the clock, or at least on the app. But rather than digress, let me just come out and say what I'm hoping you'll notice. Maybe you've already noticed it about this list of words and phrases. On this list, okay, there should be a highlight here pointing to the fact that on this list, unity appears alongside the word unite. So we have unite, unity. Now this is interesting, and it made me stop to think. Since I'd already begun to gather the thoughts I'd be sharing with you for today, when I came across this, I was startled to see the word unity in this context. Its appearance on the list complicated the account I thought I was going to give to you all of unity in comparative literature. And I mean that it made that account better, I would like to think, right? It prompted me to write in this acknowledgement that if unity is what Amazon does not want its workers to achieve, what the corporation wants to avoid at all costs, then there must be something to it. And it's worth retaining in some cases as a kind of rallying cry. Think of the slogan sometimes repeated at protests still to this day, La gente unida jamás será vencida, or in English, the people united will never be defeated. The people, right, united will never be defeated. That's clearly the sense of unity that's being summoned here. And it's clear that we need this kind of unity, this form of organization, now more than ever. Yet the pedantic professor, so I'm pivoting back again, right? The pedantic professor in me wants to ask whether, in cases like these, we're really dealing with unity, or rather something we would do better to call solidarity. Let me slow down a bit to explain what I mean. Unity is a term so sweeping in its generality and inclusiveness that, strictly speaking, it would surely draw together and encompass fulfillment center workers and corporate bosses at Amazon. Chris Smalls, the amazing union leader, and Jeff Bezos would both be united under the enormous umbrella of unity in this sense. But when the word is banned, right, the word unity is banned, or there's a move to ban the word by Bezos and other bosses at the company, they're not moving to ban appeals to unity because they think Amazon workers will recognize all they share with their employers, right? That's not what's going on. That's not the sense of unity they have in mind, right? They're imagining what would happen if workers came together collectively to make demands, extract concessions, exercise deliberative democratic power over the conditions of their employment. So what's involved in this scenario isn't exactly unity after all, but instead a kind of conflict, one that doesn't, despite what we sometimes hear the bosses say, pit the interests of workers against bosses, against the interests of bosses, right? Since these interests are already opposed. It's not the union that introduces the conflict, right? The conflict is there, whether there's a union or not. What the union does, or what unions do at their best, is allow workers to empower themselves by coming together to struggle to achieve democratic goals, working toward what are sometimes called wins, both at and beyond the workplace. This may seem like I'm giving a political speech instead of a comparative literary talk, but I'll come to the reasons for that in just a minute. So this means altering the terms of a conflict that's already ongoing when this happens, right? It's, again, not the source of a conflict, not the beginning of one. I think strength in numbers in this sense is, if we're being choosy and as precise as possible about the words we use, a matter of solidarity rather than unity per se. That doesn't mean I'd interrupt someone at a protest to say the slogan referring to La gente unida, or the people united, needs to be changed. Like that would never be my role. But there's a difference between a street demonstration and a symposium, and currently we're gathered together for the latter, not the former. We're in a university setting, which means we can parse distinctions, make suggestions, ask questions, and undertake experiments at a slight and maybe only a provisional, which is to say a temporary remove from events unfolding elsewhere. We're still in and of the world, especially though not only at a public university like UC Berkeley. But when we enter the classroom or library, we also find that we've stepped back and away from the street, the city, the market, if only briefly between activist meetings or shifts at another workplace. In this space, the space of study where we find ourselves, one thing that we can do is, to borrow Komel's language, forge connections of new kinds. This is not the same, of course, as bringing together people of diverse backgrounds, forming solidarities as part of a union campaign, but the two aren't altogether unrelated either. And one thing I've always loved about comparative literature is the space it offers for testing out textual combinations, critical conversations, including improbable ones, right? Like offbeat or unexpected, or what might initially seem like even a little bit odd couplings, pairings, convergences, constellations. These are all possible under the rubric of comparative literature. Sometimes when I'm writing a comparative essay or chapter, I imagine myself mediating between authors or critics who don't even speak the same language, who didn't share points of reference, who may not even have been alive at the same time. When their ideas converge, or just as valuably, in my view, when they diverge in an interesting way, right? Not all conversation involves perfect concordance or harmony or agreement, right? this isn't the same thing as the creation of a coalition or an alliance between diverse constituencies. And you'll notice also coalition is among the words Amazon would ban. But again, how could such a coalition, such an alliance ever come to be if there were no language and no framework allowing members to communicate, no space allowing them to gather? Comparative work can be a way of experimenting with such languages, such frameworks, and such spaces, a way of reminding ourselves and others that we've not exhausted all the ways there are to relate, to compare, to collate, to collect, and connect. So I've already begun to lay out some of my reasons for regarding the category of unity with some suspicion, as in the hypothetical example I gave of an appeal to unity that would bring together workers and bosses. It can be a mystification that distracts us from conflicts that are ongoing and consequential, right? That are already ongoing and consequential, conflicts in which we have a stake. It can also paper over the fact that sometimes conflict is what we want and need to affirm, not conflict for its own sake, but conflict as part of a collective struggle, or even individual psychic sorting out, right? A process of psychic sorting out, as when we say in response to a novel, poem, or film, I don't know, I'm conflicted. Meaning, I'm of two minds. Sometimes it's not a bad thing to be of two minds, to have a sense of internal tension or even inner turmoil. This can be a step on the way to figuring something out. It can be a response to a work of art that presents burning questions, the kind of questions that are meant to be burning. These can be prompts, stimuli that instigate rather than inhibit writing, whether that writing is critical or creative. So in the time I have left, I'd like to share some examples of what I mean, too briefly, but we can unfold, exfoliate, elaborate in the Q&A. These examples are drawn from my own work. The first two are examples of my own writing, and the third is a poem not by me, but by the trilingual Italian poet Amelia Rosselli. It's a poem I've been thinking about and writing about for some time. All three examples are also meant to be read as meditations on the symposium's key themes, and they're meant to be continuous with everything I've already been saying about gathering, unions, conflict, comparisons, and indeed even Amazon. So my first response to the kind invitation from Komal and Perlin was to ask myself whether I had any work to share, right? Naturally, right? Do I have anything appropriate, apt? By this, I had in mind work I'd already completed, whether published or otherwise, forthcoming maybe, right? And you may already have the sense that I did not have such a piece, like a ready-made, fully realized piece ready for sharing. But as I cast about in my own files for possibilities, I was reminded of two moments in my own book. So this is also a promotional presentation. My book, available on, you guessed it, Amazon. Old Schools, Modernism, Education, and the Critique of Progress. So I was reminded of these two moments because they're the only times in the book where the word unity appears. I really ran with this, even though I understood interconnected was the sort of primary title. I ran with this piece in the subtitle. So the word unity appears twice only, right? In a not epically long, but like not minimalist in its length either, right? Book. And that tells you something about the suspicion or avoidance of maybe even the allergy to unity to which I've been referring. Let me say, I think several things account for this attitude. It's not only dispositional, in other words, not only a matter of my idiosyncratic personality, right? I think it's related to, or Sigmund Freud would maybe say, over-determined by the fact that I'm a scholar of modernism, right? I'm a scholar of modernism. And since I work on the modern period in Italy, among other places, I'm also inevitably, in a sense, a scholar of fascism. So in both contexts, both in the context of literary modernism and that of Italian fascism, the value of unity can't be taken for granted, but requires careful, even painstaking thought, right? We need to stop to think when someone appeals to this category, right? Is what I'm saying in these two very different contexts. This works in different ways in the two contexts, right? In literary modernism and Italian fascism, aesthetic and political contexts, right? Modernism, in many, though not all of its guises, maybe you all have a sense of this from your coursework, right? Elevates and celebrates the fragment and assumes that unitary experience has gone the way of all things pre-modern, that it's vanished, in other words, along with the countless certainties and sources of stability and coherence that were being, as Marx and Engels would put it in the manifesto, melted into air. So we could think about some exceptions. Maybe some of you are already wanting to push back or quarrel with me a little bit, which would be fine. Maybe you have in mind like Proust or T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, right? But the scholarly consensus still sees modernism as a movement, right? Even acknowledging these exceptions, the scholarly consensus still sees modernism as a movement that prefers the part to the whole, and indeed casts doubt on the wisdom, the importance, in some cases even the possibility of attaining or sustaining unity. That way, according to the thinking of many modernists, fascism lies. So here's my first example. So that way, in the path leading necessarily, right, or inevitably towards something called capital U, unity, right, leads toward fascism, according to some people I write about, right. Here's my first example, though. Pivot. It's a sentence describing the prose style of the English author Walter Pater, who was a very early practitioner of literary modernism. Sometimes, in fact, he's not even considered a modernist, but rather a late Victorian. So Pater was famous for writing in a piecemeal fashion, quite literally, right? Ideas, if you're feeling stuck for your next final essay, right? He would compose sentences on individual strips of paper that he would then put together, right, to create paragraphs, pages, and whole texts. Like each sentence given its own strip. These would then be sort of like bundled, right, into bundles of strips, right, sets of strips that would constitute the parts of the whole text. So according to the critic I quote in my book, this was a problem, right? His works didn't model or achieve coherence as they were supposed to, presumably, right? Because they were made up of so many parts competing for attention, each calling out to be heard, seen, and contemplated on its own. I think it's worth thinking about how this kind of disjointed style might be not the result of a capricious desire to be difficult or pretentious urge to frustrate readers, but rather a way of registering the fact of a world become disjointed, a modern world, in other words. That's one thing I was trying to say about Pater in my chapter, that the way his phrases vie with one another for attention, rather than forming a seamless whole, is actually really interesting, right? Like, and worth learning from, thinking about in a serious way. What does it mean for the parts of a sentence to call attention to their status as parts, to refuse to be compliantly subsumed by the whole, the unit that's the sentence, right? What does it mean, if you'll permit me to borrow a phrase from Twitter, for parts of speech themselves to become ungovernable? If we move on from Pater, we can fast forward a whole century. This is the entire span covered by my book chronologically, right? We can fast forward a whole century and come to another appeal to the modern. This one was first made not in English, but in French, and not in a work of literature, but a volume of philosophical film theory, a book called Cinema 2, The Time Image by Gilles Deleuze. I'll spare you the full argument, which is enormously complex and involved. If you're a film person, then maybe you wanna find out about it later, right? Or maybe you've already found out about it. Someone's brought you the good news. But let me just distill in the time I have left very quickly. Writing in 1985, Deleuze is still thinking about the problem of parts and wholes, and about the allegiance to the part, the partial, the particular, and the plural as opposed to the singular that he sees in modernist, or what he calls modern works of art, especially film. So he's making this distinction between what he calls classical political cinema and modern political cinema. Allow me to quote myself, quoting Deleuze at some length. The context of the chapter is that Deleuze is writing about a Brazilian director named Glauber Rocha. Early on, Deleuze writes, so you can see it's like top of slide, right? Early on, Deleuze writes, Rocha could sustain his belief in a united or unified people, but this belief gave way to a sense of the irreducible plurality and particularity of peoples. According to Deleuze, modern political cinema, as forged, there's that word again, by Rocha and others, proceeds from the recognition that the people are missing. Missing, that is, constitutively, not only in the making or awaiting invention. The people are always, right, multiple and heterogeneous. It follows that no amount of awareness will bring about the collective oneness that classical cinema, right, before modern political cinema, both presupposes and enacts or produces, right? It's not enough then to become conscious, where, as in classical political cinema, this marks the first step toward belonging to a people moving forward. For those in the third world, and this is a period specific, right? I'm not calling them that. They are calling themselves that, right? It's like a period specific phrase, right? Those in the third world made into, quote, perpetual minorities, end quote. Such narratives of advance become untenable. There is no longer a general line, that is, of evolution from the old to the new, or of revolution, which produces a leap from one to the other. It is, Deleuze writes, in the context of this discrediting of progress narratives that Rocha, the director, rethinks his own youthful stance. The death knell for becoming conscious was precisely the consciousness that there were no people, but always several peoples, an infinity of peoples who remain to be united, or should not be united, in order for the problem to change. And I'll stop quoting myself, but suffice it to say that I think that's really interesting, this fact that like he himself is halting in the delivery of this statement about parts and wholes, right? Minorities and majorities, an infinity of peoples who remain to be or should not be, right? There's this kind of not exactly decomposition, but a fragmentation at the level of the sentence itself that I think is very interesting. So I can say more about all of this during the Q&A, but what I want to convey most clearly for now is the importance of understanding what Deleuze, this philosopher, means when he says the people are missing. There's just been a book come out in 2021 called The People Are Missing. So there's a whole response to this claim that we could think about. But very, very briefly, for him, this is a fact to be recognized, right? The people are missing. This is a fact to be recognized, not a temporary state of affairs to be amended, right? Something to be upset about, right? It just is the case that the people are missing, he's saying. And in his view, this is an explicitly anti-fascist position, a stance that opposes the fascist drive relentlessly to unify, to deny, and subsume difference. So why would someone claim that the people are missing in this sense? In order, Deleuze answers, for the problem to change, right? In order for the problem to change. The implication here is that we focused for so long on how to come together as peoples, so often under the sign of a nation, that we've lost sight of other possibilities, other problems in the sense of other questions that would guide our thoughts. We've been asking the wrong question, erring because we've always had unity as our horizon, or on the horizon, right? Our imagined destination or goal. What Deleuze is asking becomes possible if we don't envision unity as desirable or politically necessary. We'd still have problems. So it's not going to solve all our problems, right? There'd still be problems, but our response to them might be made more dynamic by the fact that they would not be the same old problems, but new changed ones. In my work since the book was published in 2020, I've been trying to be guided and inspired by this passage in several senses. First, my new research is about theories of revolutionary change that do not unfold under the sign of unity. And second, I'm writing about theorists and poets who understand themselves as likely to be regarded as perpetual minorities. They're writing at a time when both poetry and revolutionary theory are regarded with suspicion or dismissal or trivializing contempt, right? At a time when it's hard for them to take themselves seriously. They're negligible, right? These things, poetry and this particular strand of theory, and not seen to matter to serious politics or adult public debate. I only have time to share one example very briefly. It'll be familiar to Professor Largier, and I share it in particular because it's such a vivid and beautiful treatment of the problems that I've been discussing. So this poet, Amelia Rosselli, has a poem called General Strike, 1969. And we won't have time to do it justice, obviously, but it's the last slide I'll share. And if you would like during the Q&A, we could think more about it. I provided here in the original Italian and English translation. Basically, right, what's interesting to me most of all is that the poem begins with a lamplit scene of assembly. So a scene of people gathering in real time. But protest in this moment, 1969, has become a matter of apparent childishness. The Italian is infantilismo apparente, which is a bit stronger than the English, right? So protest has become infantilized. The dream that things could be different, right? That a general strike could democratize not just workplaces, but every place. This dream persists, but the poem also shows it fading, right? I mean, I think it's very beautiful and interesting, right? The poem stages this kind of like fading of the dream as the speaker moves from vernacular enthusiasm in the first moments of the poem to the relative isolation of the concluding parenthesis. This parenthesis asks, with the enclosure of its punctuation mark suggesting a kind of withdrawal into privacy, what it would mean not just to revolutionize society, but also the self, the I itself. How can this I give up the safety of its privilege? How can it join in the collective howl of protest without being altogether undone in the process? Or maybe it's the case that undoing is the point. But if so, what does that mean? What does it mean to undo? Or as Rosselli would say, abolish the I. Since the possibility of withdrawal at the end, right, of difference from the surrounding space and the people it contains still remains available to the speaker at the end of the poem, we're not dealing with unity defined as a kind of merger with, subsumption by, or dissolution into the crowd. There are peoples, gente here, plural is important, right? The translation gives us singular people, but it's actually peoples. But the poem does, I think, suggest it makes a difference to gather, to forge connections, to participate in the production of a common, if also a discordant sound, right? Again, a howl. Sometimes it's unifying, a step towards solidarity, just to howl when someone tells you you can't, to be brought together just by uttering words and phrases someone tells you are banned. Thank you. I hope there's still time for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Before we start with the audience Q&A, I just wanted to thank you for that incredibly thought-provoking presentation. And I actually had a question. I'm really interested, like, first of all, that poem was, wow, so, I mean, amazing. I felt it, like, here in my chest. I'm interested in how you sort of investigate the I and how that relates to sort of unity and being one with the crowd. It's interesting that you say it isn't subsumed in the crowd, which I feel like we kind of even get like from the audacious crowd. It feels like there is an individuality, there is sort of something to it. And also, yes, the parenthesis is at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of, I lost on my own,
Good.
to solitary God, and then revolutionizing myself in the people, and removing myself from heaven. That almost feels like some sort of abstraction where the I sort of dives into the parts, as it were, versus the whole. And so I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate a little bit on that idea of the I.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a problem for her, right?
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, there's an impulse to be rid of the encumbrance, right? Like the long tradition of lyric, right? Like sort of lyric poetry's elevation and celebration of the ego, right? Like the speaker, the individual poet with his, at that time, his, right? Like special sensibility, right? She wants to push against that. But on the other, here she is being like, oh, P.S., here's what happened, right? Like it's like, the parenthesis is poignant, not least because it's like she's just been out there in the street, right, observing things, right, watching things happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the unfolding of this beautiful scene at the beginning is incredible. And it's not that I think we're meant to think of this as the inevitable conclusion, right?
Right.
As though there could only be a kind of withdrawal, but I think the parenthesis indicates, right, that the I remains a problem. It's like, it's not clear. I don't think she's giving like a programmatic statement about what's to be done with the I. I think she's like reminding us that it's still a problem.
Right. It does seem very discrete, as like the parenthesis begins with the I and is sort of set off by itself. So the I definitely does remain discrete in some kind of way at the end of the column.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I'm really glad you saw that. I know it came and went quickly, but that was really like what I wanted to point out. So this is like the parts of the sentences that don't that don't compliantly sync up with or become subsumed by the whole in Pater. It's sort of like I wanted to say also the people, right, who would not be or should not be united in Deleuze. So I realize these are very different moments, but there was something interesting about the persistence of the part in each case.
Absolutely. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, go for it.
Yeah, I was super interested in what you had to say about Deleuze, and I was just wondering, does he deal mainly with context and with content, or does he also look at film as a medium? Because I feel like there's an interesting comparison between what he has to say and then what Benjamin says about the democratizing power of film and how, you know, it's the coming together of a producer, a director, a cinematographer to make the film, and then we literally come together in movie theaters to watch it. So do you feel like that I versus we mentality is only in the content of the film, and saying that there's this one person who represents a host of problems that, you know, could be different for every individual, you know, and there definitely are problems with that, but do you feel like that's a thing for only content or also for the medium of filmmaking as well?
Really great question, not least.
1 second. Do you want to just tell me your name as well?
Yeah, sorry, Devin.
Devin, thank you so much. So it's a great question, not least because we're living through this moment of kind of like interrogation of or kind of soul searching about cinema as medium, right? Like, is there going to be collective reception anymore, or will we just be streaming forever, like in our little pods with our little laptops, you know, hearing on our headphones the impoverished sound quality and so forth. So it's an excellent question. He's a philosopher, right? So cinema is, I would argue, like being a little bit, you know, it's like being kind of marshaled, right? For him to make, like, it enables him to make his philosophical argument, right? Like, so his main, he never like sort of like, I mean, sometimes he'll notice beautiful things, like beautiful details, and that will, like, that observation, that very specific medium sensitive observation will find its way into what he's writing. But overall, he's not interested in like sort of the specific workings of film as medium, even though the whole argument is about what film as medium makes possible, like what it affords that the still image, for example, might not. And content does become relevant because the distinction here between classical and modern is also about the difference between Hollywood and Soviet cinema on the one hand, and what he calls third world cinema, which includes Italians, weirdly, right, on the other. So, like, it is also about the way masses, like collectives, assemblies, groups of people are figured on screen. That does matter to him, whether, as in what he thinks of, like his account of Soviet cinema, right, is like that it's about the celebration of, right, this formation of a collective, right, unity. And what he's saying about you know, third world cinema is that it's challenging us by showing the collective in a different way, right? Not in a kind of mode of unitary celebration or affirmation of the people, capital T, capital P, right? So I'm not sure if I answered your question directly, but I think I would say it's both, right? Medium, so with the caveat that he's a philosopher, so seeing film through that lens, but also content matters for sure.
Anyone else? Do we have?
Hi, so I'm Kirsten from San Francisco. I'm 57 years old, so probably one of the oldest people in this room. But that lovely line in the parentheses about her losing her, I lost on my own that vertical love of a solitary God. First of all, that's so cool. You're just talking about the pandemic and the way that we're experiencing things through basically tubes, right?
Exactly.
You're in your little pod and you have this, hopefully high speed line to your content, and it just keeps going back and forth. And my strong image there was, it used to be when you would go to a drive-through that you would have these pneumatic tubes there were actually tubes that went from where your car pulled up to the person in the window over there. And you would put the check you wanted to deposit in a tube. I didn't even ever do this. This is for my childhood. You put your check into this sealed tube and you'd stick it in there and it would go, and the thing would literally go to an office and it would go to this woman, and then whatever you needed would come back to you in the tube. But I just think this notion of prayers in that kind of tube, or in other words, if all of our thoughts are supposed to go through these lines and these channels and these tubes, I just heard turn a phrase of the vertical love of a solitary God, or just the concept that something as powerful as prayer would be conceived of in such a unilateral, like a tube-like thing, that her faith would be, because we think of faith as happening in churches as being so communal, and here she's talking about losing it in such a clear individual tube-like line. So I just thought there's great tension between, we think of religion as communal, but she's talking, I lost on my own that vertical love of a solitary God, that slender thread, and it just, that notion of putting our prayers in the tube like the old bank machines was just so powerful. The other thing I thought of when you were talking about your allergy to the word unity, and that is that as now a cranky old woman, the worst thing I can possibly hear is, let's just agree to disagree. Because to me, the fracture is still there, and we're just taking out the wall, in the interest of unity, we're taking out the wallpaper paste and we're putting up wallpaper. The crack is absolutely still there. We're always going to see it. And you're just kind of papering it over in the interest of unity, or slamming a door on our conversation because we're so dedicated to the concept of unity that we can't handle the fact that we have to close it by trying to erase the difference, right? So I just was so struck when you talked about being almost allergic to the word.
Yeah, and I guess what I was trying to suggest, I'm not sure how clearly it came through, is that also literature, right, is worth studying, not least because it's a place that teaches us how conflict, right, is generative and important, right, and we need
It's
it.
a starting place.
Exactly, not just what should be kind of swept under the rug or minimized or denied or forgotten.
Let's agree to
about.
disagree.
Exactly.
Let's just.
Exactly.
It's that to me is just always the slamming of a door on a conversation.
Exactly.
So anyway, share your allergy.
Thank you, and thanks also for the amazing image of the tubes. That's like really good to think.
Sometimes being old helps. Do we have any more questions? Yeah. Carolyn?
Yeah. I suppose this is more of an existential question.
Oh no.
So I just wanted to return to what you were talking about from your book, Old Schools. I guess like from a postmodern or like Deleuzian framework, like how do people, is it possible for people to become whole or unified? Or how do we like reconcile this like constant lack that I'm not super familiar with Deleuze, but I'm assuming that that's like one of the key aspects of like his theory of just like lack or like something missing or so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting, and the reason there's this book now it's simply called The People Are Missing, right? 2021, is because the phrase first occurs in the context of his writing about Kafka, right? Deleuze and Guattari's book about Kafka and the category of minor literature. And there it has one sense or significance, right? The people are missing. But by the time 1985 is quite late, right? By the time you get to Cinema 2, the people are missing acquires a different like tonality. And also he believes a little less in revolutionary possibility than he did in the Kafka project, right? So one reason I didn't want to end with Deleuze, but with Rosselli, is because I thought it was a more, right, like a kind of sensibility more responsive to the moment. No one's taking the bait, by the way. But a sensibility more kind of alive to or awake to the present in which we find ourselves than this. It's a little bit, how to put it? it's a little anti-Marxist, right? To say the people are missing definitively, right? But that it's almost as if like la gente no será unida, right? Right, like, and that's, I think it's very important because he's taking seriously the claims of minorities in many, many parts of the world, right? To not want to form part of the whole, right? Like in various ways, and that's like it's good that he was thinking about the importance of those lessons, right? And how they could serve as correctives to like a certain dogmatic Marxist insistence on, right? The whole. Not to say that's Marx himself, like what he would have, how he would have put it, or what he would have wanted, or whatever. Just what Marxism had become, right? By that time, he was stepping back from and taking some distance from. So I don't think it's actually. I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but I don't think it's a lack in the like psychoanalytic sense, which he absolutely despised, right? Like Deleuze hated Freud and really, really hated this notion that we were like forever lacking, that desire was about like filling a void and kind of like pursuing something we didn't already have. Like he was much more interested in thinking about like plenitude, right? And it's a little like manic sometimes, the Deleuzian way of right, like insisting on plenitude and possibility. So I don't think missing, even though it's monk, right? Like, but I don't think it's yeah. I mean, it's worth thinking about like because I guess you can't simply deactivate that sense, right? It's always going to be there. But I don't think, at least on the surface, that's what he's wanting us to take from it. Some sense of kind of like inward missing, right?
Yeah.
It just did I hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially, and I'll like wrap up, but
Please.
initially it felt so bleak for you to just say, you know, that unity perhaps is not the framework that we should or I don't know, judge revolutionary movements for, or just like people in general, or perhaps I'm misrepresenting what you were saying. But you know, towards the end, and after your explanation, I see like there's a lot of, it's just different. There's a lot of like hope in seeing things from a different point of view, or not even a point of view, but a different, like just a different framework. And it feels like a lot less bleak, that individuality or, you know, a body or one part can be just a part. It doesn't need to be part of something bigger unless, I don't know. There's probably a theory to explain that as well.
No,
But,
this,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, no, I exactly. I mean, I think on one hand, this is extremely bleak, but on the other, within hours of the release of this, like people were finding codes, right? Like they were.
That's
coming
what
up
my
with-
instinct was. Get out my thesaurus. Here,
Yeah,
I had to
exactly.
work around every one of those words.
Yeah, there were like synonyms, but also kind of like asterisks and, you know, various ways to evade the detectors that were within. I mean, it was like remarkable how quickly people resourcefully responded, right? So it's not as if this is like simply a top-down.
See, we're all revolutionary.
Right? I mean, it's not as if this this goes unanswered, right? You have another question.
Yeah, I'm super fascinated by this idea of the age of technology and how that might put us in more of a liminal space between the collective and the personal, especially because like you mentioned Twitter, like someone can post something on Twitter and you can feel it on a deeply emotional or personal level and retweet it. So it's still that person's words, and yet it's kind of this collective idea that's being perpetuated and constantly reproduced for individual reasons. And I think that that's a really fascinating kind of combination between Deleuzian theory and then the poem as well. And what came to mind was, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Guatemalan film La Llorona. Like it's beautiful. In the daytime, there shouts the howls of the people who are protesting outside this house, and at nighttime that melds into La Llorona's weeping. And so I'm fascinated by this liminal space and how technology might influence the liminal space between us and I.
Yeah, you know, the one time I don't know if we need to wrap up in a sec.
We'll wrap up after this question.
Okay. Beautiful film. I'm glad you saw it. Everyone, yeah, I recommend to everyone La Llorona, by Guatemalan director whose name is escaping me, but it's really worth seeing. Not the horror film like Nona, so be careful when you're looking for it. It's a Guatemalan version, like, very artfully done. The one I was going to say is just a sort of silly note to end on. But I did happen to see Zuckerberg in the flesh once. Not like I ran into him on the street, but because I knew someone who was working at Instagram immediately after its acquisition by Facebook. So I went to the Facebook holiday party in like 2011, maybe 2010, 2011, 2012, one of those years. And it was like on the pier in San Francisco. And at that time, Zuckerberg was very keen to take credit for the Arab Spring. And so he said to the worker, he said to the staff there to celebrate the holiday party, right? He said, we did this, right? About the Arab Spring. Like, we, technology companies, made possible the moment of uprising and revolutionary possibility, right? That was the Arab Spring. And so I guess I always think about that when I hear a kind of like move toward techno-utopian anything, right? Even while I understand, I think it's your point about Twitter is that it could have counter uses, right? Like that there could be counter uses, not that Twitter itself would be given credit for world transformation, but that there could be a counter use of that medium, which I completely agree with. I think we have to hope for that, right? Because otherwise it's very bleak indeed, right? Thank you so much for your patience and your questions. Yeah, really glad the poem spoke to at least some of you, and it was a pleasure to be here on this beautiful morning with you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day's presentations, and good luck.
Thank you, Professor McGlazer, for all of your thoughtful work.